Hello, my name is Selena and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in November. Quick announcement before we get started with the wrap up. I'm changing my filming schedule, so I will basically be posting on Wednesdays and Sundays now, and then maybe some extra books and like reviews on other off days, but Wednesdays and Sundays are the day now. So that's that. Now we can get into the books. So for my November stats, I read 10 total things. Most of them were novels, 7 of them were novels, and 3 were little novellas. As for my star ratings, I gave 4 things 3 stars, and 4 things 4 stars, and then only 2 things 5 stars. And then as for stats, I read 7 fantasy books, 2 sci-fi books, and 1 horror book. And for my age ranges, I read 5 adult books, 4 young adult books, and 1 middle grade. Does that equal 10? Yes, it does. Cool. And then as usual, I will be moving from the books that I liked the least to the books that I liked the most, and there will be timestamps so that you can skip around if you don't want to hear about all these books. Which book to talk about first? The 3 stars were all very, very similar in terms of quality, so okay. My gut's telling me that this was my least favorite, and my least favorite book was actually the one horror book I read, and that is Rolling in the Deep by Mira Grant. So this is a little novella. This is also one of the novellas that I read. And it is the prequel to Into the Drowning Deep, which you can kind of see up here in my horror shelf. It is one of my favorite books. It is by far my favorite horror, and it is like one of my favorite books I have ever read. And it is pretty much a horror book that is based around killer mermaids. So good. And Rolling in the Deep takes place before Into the Drowning Deep, but it was actually written first. And so it's not really a prequel, like technically Into the Drowning Deep is like a sequel or an expansion of the story, really. But Rolling in the Deep, you don't need to read it to read Into the Drowning Deep. And honestly, I wouldn't really recommend it. It was like a 3-star for me, so I didn't love it at all. It was pretty average. Like, it was okay, but it didn't have what was so special about Into the Drowning Deep for me. Rolling in the Deep follows a event that you hear about in Into the Drowning Deep because it is the inciting event to where people kind of realize there's something out in the water and we want to go find out what it is. We want to find out like whether what we're seeing happens through footage really happened, because this seems impossible. And so Into the Drowning Deep, you're following the second mission out into the ocean, Mariana Trench, to find whatever is there. Whereas Rolling in the Deep is the first mission. So this is the first thing where no one knew this was going to happen. They didn't know these creatures existed. And then, well, it's a brutal horror. So Rolling in the Deep in that was not anything new for me. I'd heard all about this voyage in Rolling in the Deep. The Otter Goddess, I think, is what the voyage is called. And I knew all about it from Into the Drowning Deep. But I still wanted to see, like, the lead up to it, but it really didn't live up to the hype I had put around it just because I loved Into the Drowning Deep so much. Pretty much it keeps the Into the Drowning Deep slow pacing, but for a really short period. Like Into the Drowning Deep for the first like half-ish is kind of slow. You're getting to know the characters, you're getting to know the vibe of the ship. This creeping unease and suspense is kind of, it's there throughout the entire book and you're on the edge of your seat, but nothing intense is happening quite yet. And then Rolling in the Deep was similar. Like, it took like 2/3 through this novella, hours and hours, to get to any sort of horror aspects. And so in a novel that was more slow burn, I didn't mind that. But in a novella, it felt like there wasn't enough story that I, you know, this author was trying to cover to warrant the amount of time. And this is a short book, but it didn't warrant the amount of time we spent setting it up, you know? But in hindsight, I can kind of see why it is that way, because Rolling in the Deep was published first. So it was Mira Grant experimenting with this idea. And in my opinion, it sort of feels like she decided to do it better because she realized Rolling in the Deep was not the right format for a story like this. So to me, Into the Drowning Deep feels like a do-over for her. It feels like a do-over where it's like, okay, there were so many interesting things, and let me delve into them in the way that they deserve to be delved into. But that's how it felt to me. That may not be the case. That's entirely speculation just on how it felt. It could be that she had them both written or wrote Into the Drowning Deep first, and Rolling the Deep was first to be put out into the world. I don't know what happened with this, but it did feel like a less good version of Into the Drowning Deep because it was dealing with a lot of the same things, just in a less good way for me. So yeah, that's that one. The next one, I guess the next one has to be Rise of Empire by Michael J. Sullivan. So this is actually 2 books in one. The first one is Nifron Rising, and the second one is The Emerald Storm, and they are books 3 and 4 in the Rhyuria Revelations. And we're just continuing the plots. So I can't really tell you anything about this other than we're following Royce and Hadrian on their adventures that follow after books 1 and 2 in Theft of Swords. And we're also following several other characters who I think carried these books. In my opinion, Royce and Hadrian's plots were never as interesting as the women's plots in this book, really, usually. In the first book, Royce and Hadrian's plot is with one of the other woman characters, and I didn't think that plot was super interesting, but the other plot, the more like subplot with another woman character who we'd met previously, her plot I really, really enjoyed. And then continuing that into book 4, The Emerald Storm was really, really good. And there was 2 other plots. One was Royce and Hadrian's, and that one I enjoyed more than I did in the third book. I enjoyed what Royce and Hadrian were doing in the 4th book more than what they were doing in the 3rd one. And then there was also another plot in book 2 that was also a woman-led plot that I thought was really fun. And so the first one was kind of a miss for me. It was like a 3-star. It was like, okay, Nifron Rising, it's good, but it's not as good as the last 2 that I just read, like Avanpartha and The Crown Conspiracy. It wasn't as good as those, so whatever. And then Emerald Storm was my favorite for a while. Like, as of now, my ranking of the 4 books I've read is the first one, Crown Conspiracy, then Avanpartha, and then probably The Emerald Storm because I liked so much of it. And then my last one is Nifron Rising, so far. But The Emerald Storm, I think the ending was worse than any of the endings I've seen thus far. It was just, like, I don't think either of these books in the middle bind-up are as tight as the first 2 in the first bind-up were, but The Emerald Storm was so fun, and then it just could not land a single ending, in my opinion. So that kind of, I was like, oh man, this could have been like a 4, like really fun 4 stars, but just the way it ended and like how everything just resolved or didn't resolve, I just didn't like it very much, and I found it very, like, I found the plots very convoluted in this second volume, especially in the 4th book, so it wasn't for me, and I ended up giving them both like somewhere in the 3-star range, and so this book got a 3-star from me. And I still think on my reading experience of it fondly, and I still think of these characters fondly, and I do want to continue with this book. I still like Michael J. Sullivan's writing style, I guess. I'm hoping the books 5 and 6, aka 3rd volume, Heir of Novaron, is better. I think I gave this a slightly higher rating than my final 3-star, but it was also disappointing to me, but it didn't have as much to disappoint me about, so that's why it got higher. It got a higher rating because it was kind of meh, but it wasn't meh in a series that I absolutely adored, and that book is Along the SaltYC by A. Deborah Baker, aka Shauna McGuire. I read 2 Shauna McGuire novellas, and they were both, this is again a situation where Along the SaltYC was very meh. Like, I love some of what Shauna McGuire produces, like Into the Drowning Deep or Over the Woodward Wall was great, some of the Wayward Children's books, and sometimes they just fall completely flat. And this is one where it fell a little bit flat. It wasn't my least favorite of Shauna McGuire's novellas or books that I've read, and it wasn't like just entirely meh, it was still fun, but it was just like, we didn't progress the plot at all. Like, we just kind of pittered around for the entire book, and at the end it just made me so mad when the book was like, oh, like, our 2 characters had no idea that it was all just beginning. And it's like, what? Why is it we are 2 novellas into this now, we are 200 pages into the story, and Over the Woodward Wall had a lot of progression to the point where you almost think it could be a standalone until you get to the ending and you're like, okay, yeah, we haven't progressed all that far. Like, there's still a lot to do, but it still felt like a good, like, leap forward. Whereas, like, Along the SaltYC, if Over the Woodward Wall was a leap forward, Along the SaltYC was where we just ran in a circle for a little bit and did nothing else. We didn't move forward. We didn't move backwards. We just were right there. We just ran in a circle. And I completely lost sight of the plot and what we were meant to be doing there. And then the book also spends like several pages in the very beginning recapping the entirety of book 1. And it was so boring. I was like, I just read this. And I know some people, haven't just read it, but there wasn't an overly large amount of time between book 1 and book 2, so I don't know why we needed such heavy re-summary. I don't know. Along the SaltYC, it was kind of disappointing for me, so that one's number 3, I guess. This next one, y'all. Arguably my most disappointing, but not my least favorite of the month, is Cytonic by Brandon Sanderson. All right, let's talk about it. So I reviewed this on Goodreads, and that has all the things that I don't want to say here. Like, it has all the things that I can't remember, and my brain's not, like, good enough at remembering them off the top of my head to recite them all to you here. So if you want to see a more full review of why I thought Cytonic was disappointing, and honestly a step down from the rest of the series, you can go check out that Goodreads review. I will leave it linked down below in the description. What it comes down to is this book does not have enough meat in it to warrant this entire book. I think this was a common theme with a lot of my 3 stars, except for Rise of Empire, which actually, Rise of Empire felt like we almost had too many things going on, but it still managed to feel like we weren't progressing that much, I think, with Rise of Empire, but more than these others, because Cytonic, along with SaltYC and Rolling in the Deep, like, didn't add very much to the series that they are a part of. And I think that especially is true with Cytonic and Along the SaltYC, because they literally did just feel like that going in circles instead of moving us forward in the plot. Cytonic moved the needle a little bit, but a lot of this felt kind of pointless. It didn't feel like we had the same stakes that we had in the other books. It almost felt like Sanderson realized he wanted this whole Cytonic sequence to happen, but he didn't know where it fit, and it honestly should have been a shorter book than this, but he wanted it to be a whole other book in the series, so he of course had to stretch it out as much as humanly possible, and he did it, but this shouldn't have been stretched out. And I think a lot of the, like, Sanderson has talked about this, and I don't want to, like, use what he's saying against him necessarily, but he's talked about how it took him a while to do this, and the edits, like, he had to keep doing edits because it wasn't coming back. The feedback was not coming back the way he wanted it. And this happened over and over again. And I think it's probably because we don't have very much progression. But if you are a reader who, I don't want to say wasn't expecting very much of him, because I think we all expect a lot from Sanderson. But if you're a reader who is just good to go with the flow and who is not here for tons of plot, who is not here for deep, deep character work, this is good enough, right? Like, it is a good enough book. I'm just used to better from Sanderson. So that's kind of where I'm thinking, like, because to me, this book doesn't have the character depth that I thought it would, and that I feel like Starsight set it up to have. Like, what happens at the end of Starsight feels very dramatic, and it feels very dramatic for Spensa. And so I felt like we would have a very dramatic story coming out of Cytonic, and I think that Sanderson did want to return to the form of character work leading the story like it did in Skyward. I don't think he succeeded, and I think that he masked that not succeeding with this rompy, fun sort of story, and as a result, I ended up not having that much fun, because that's not why I read the Skyward books. I read the Skyward books for the thrilling action and the deep character work from Spensa and the, like, voice of the main character, which is so lovely and unique, and I just don't feel like I got any of that from Cytonic. So that is the short version of why I didn't love this book. But I think that if you want to know why in more detail, you should go check out my review of it, because I certainly have more to say. Moving on to the 4 stars, and this is actually where I really started very genuinely enjoying these books, because both 4 stars that I got were 4.25 stars, and then the other 2 4 stars I classified are actually 4.5 stars. So the first 4.25 stars I'm going to talk about, I think, is going to be Redawn by Brandon Sanderson and Jancy Patterson. And this is the second novella that kind of takes place as Cytonic is happening, but came out before Cytonic. It was kind of a lead up to the release of Cytonic. And there's one more coming out in December, and I'm very excited for that one. But Redawn picks up pretty much right where we left off with the first novella, Sunreach. And all of these novellas focus on characters other than Spensa. And the character who we focus on in Redawn is a character who we've never really met. That we know about her, but we've never really met her outside of like 2 seconds. And so it was interesting to be in her head finally and to see her worldview, and I don't want to spoil anything, so I don't want to say very much more, but I just think these novellas are super, super fun, and they get the job done. I think that they are just fast and fun, and they do what they need to do, which I don't think Cytonic did this time around. So yeah, the next 4.25 stars is The Atlas 6 by Olivia Blake, and this is like a fantasy dark academia story. I don't even know how to describe this because it's not my usual, but I ended up giving it 4.25 stars. It's very odd. I will say, if you like Gideon the Ninth, I do think you could enjoy this. They're nothing alike, honestly, but they feel similar to me, and that's all I can really say about that. I don't really know anything else. But you follow 6 characters who you get a very deep look inside their mind. This is a very character-driven book and ideas-driven book. So we follow 6 characters who are all very morally gray, and they are basically invited to be a part of they're like initiates of the Library of Alexandria, which has actually survived the whole time, but is like hidden and is for magical knowledge pretty much only. And there's this whole hidden aspect of the magical world. There's the magical world, I'm pretty sure it's kind of known about in our world because this is kind of our world, just different, but I don't think how deep the knowledge goes is known by normal people. So unless you happen to be at the Library of Alexandria. So pretty much we have the 6 initiates, and we know that one of them will die by the time this initiation is over. So, and 5 will be accepted as full members of the Library of Alexandria, and they will like protect the knowledge and research and things like that. And so they're all very gifted, and they're all very morally gray, and they all have their own backstories and their own motivations and wants. And I thought that the character work was very good, in my opinion. And I think that the character interactions are probably why I loved this book so much, or enjoyed this book so much. I don't know if I loved it, but I think that the character interactions were very different, and they felt very well-rounded, and they just made sense. So I enjoyed them. And then there's also a very like physical sort of magic system that is kind of it works with our world's physics and stuff, and so it kind of expands upon that. And I love that kind of stuff. I love when you like pretend that your magic is possible with our laws of science or whatever. I kind of like that. So I really enjoyed that. It was really the magic system and the character interactions that kept me reading this book. I don't know why necessarily, because it doesn't have a plot. Like, it doesn't have very much of a plot at all. But I so enjoyed this book. And something just kept me reading, and I do recommend it. Maybe not if you're the biggest fan of dark academia. I'm not, and so the fact that this wasn't as dark academia as it could have been didn't bother me. That's kind of how I like dark academia. I'm not a dark academia person, and the only dark academia I really read is if it has fantasy in it. Yeah, I don't know if I would recommend this to you if your favorite book is like The Secret History or something, but maybe if you're like me and dark academia is not really your thing, but you're interested in this because magic and characters that seem flawed and lovable, yeah, maybe go for it. The next book that I'm going to talk about is my one middle grade, and that is Bridge of Souls by Victoria Schwab. So this got 4.5 stars from me. I love this series so much. It is just such a fun series about a girl whose family hunts ghosts for a living, but they can't really see them. They're not full believers really, but our main character Cassidy can fully see them and can kind of cross between the ghost world and our world through the veil. And she has a ghost best friend. So this girl is traveling around to all these haunted locations to film a TV show with her parents. And so they're showing her all these haunted spaces, and she's like, And she can actually see all the haunted things going on, and has her ghost best friend making snide comments right next to her. And it's just so fun, so wholesome, so good. This book, they're kind of like Ghost of the Week kind of books. They are like kind of wrap up, but there is kind of threads that go through all of, there is an order to them, but it's not like a huge overarching plot. Like, it is definitely more of a standalone type of plot. Like, they wrap up is what I'm trying to say. You don't have to read them all, but I will read as many as Victoria Schwab puts out because I adore these books so much, and I would let her publish like 33 of them, and I would never complain because I love them so much. And really what gets me about the series is honestly the friendships between Cassidy and her friends, especially her ghost best friend. And I think the plots are just really fun. I really enjoy this like middle grade paranormal vibe. Like, the Graveyard Book has a similar feel. And I loved it. I love this series so much. So Yeah. The final 4.5 star I read is Six Crimson Crayons by Elizabeth Lim. I really, really enjoyed this book a lot. This book was so refreshing to me. It's a YA book that combines two fairy tales. One is kind of more commonly used to inspire fairy tales, and that's The Six Swans by the Brothers Grimm. I'm running out of light, but we will continue trekking on. And the other one is like The Girl with the Bowl on Her Head or something. It's like a Japanese fairy tale or folklore piece. And those combinations of fairy tales was so good. This Asian-inspired world was so refreshing to read about, especially amongst fairy tale retellings, which, especially if you're going to be retelling like a Grimm's fairy tale, they're usually more European inspired, but this was not. And so I so enjoyed this book. It was just really fun and refreshing for me to read, and it was read really quickly for me. It's a very much more like younger side of YA, and I don't think it's like the best YA book I've ever read, but it is pretty dang good for me at least. I thought it was really fun. I think there were things about the plot that didn't quite make sense, or plot holes, or rushed executions, but a lot of that didn't really bother me because I had so much fun with it. So I'm going to say if you're someone who would be bothered by any of those things, you may not enjoy this as much, but I really wasn't, and I'm more willing to tolerate that in not only YA, but also fairy tale retellings in YA, especially, and also in other genres, because fairy tale retellings, I mean, it's a fairy tale, right? So it kind of things just sort of happen, and there's conveniences in all fairy tales. So yeah, I so enjoyed this. So I'm really excited for the second book coming out next year. And also, I say this every single time, but this cover, oh my gosh. Now on to my final two books of the month, and they were both favorites of the year. I don't even know fully how to rank them, but I think I'm gonna go Kingkiller first. So this was my first 5-star. This was amazing. I love this book so much. At first, I wasn't super impressed with old Kingkiller and old Patrick Rothfuss and Kvothe. I wasn't super, blown away, and then I was, and I never stopped being blown away for the rest of this book, and I adored it. I loved the character. I loved the character work. I was so invested in the plot, and there wasn't a ton of, overarching plot, but I am so invested in Kvothe and his life. I don't really know what else to say about this book because I feel like everything else has been said already, but just know that I'm on the hype train. I adore The Name of the Wind. It's one of my favorite books of all time, one of my favorite fantasies, one of my favorite books of the year, and I'm excited. I'm excited to read the next book in December, even though people tend to like that one not as much. And then my final 5-star of the month was Fireboard by Rosaria Munda. I love Fireboard so much. If you don't know about this book, this is a YA book as well, and it's about a Roman-inspired kind of world, not even. It's kind of like if a world that was more feudal European type in nature adopted Plato's Republic views of meritocracy. And it was a bloody adaptation of a meritocracy. It wasn't just we all collectively decide we want to do things in a meritocracy type way. No, this was a bloody rebellion where lots of people were killed on both sides of the rebellion. Before the rebellion, the feudal lords were killing peasants in their area constantly, it was a slaughterhouse, and then it was a bloodbath when the revolution officially took over and they killed pretty much all of the noble families. And we follow kids whose families were on different sides of this conflict. We have Lee, whose name is short for Leo. He is the son of an old noble, and when his family was killed on this day of a giant massacre of all the nobles, he was actually spared and put into an orphanage. And at the orphanage, he meets Annie, whose family was killed by the same lord that is Leo's father, back before the revolution when he was in charge of them. And the way he did that was with dragons. One of the main aspects of this meritocracy is now the dragons do not belong to noble families, and the art of dragon riding is not just for noble families, it's for anyone who can test into it. And so both Annie and Lee test into it, and we follow them present day after they've sort of grown up together in this orphanage with this unspoken understanding that they come from very different places and they should not be friends necessarily, but they do care about each other so much. They both become dragon riders, and we see them competing for the position of the top dragon riding general, basically. And I adore these characters so much. I adore their relationship. It is so complex. It is so emotional. This book takes so many YA tropes and just does them in such a deep, amazing way. An example, the orphan hero trope in YA is constant. Lots of people are orphaned in YA. One big example of this that is very similar to this, but done worse, in my opinion, is Mal and Alina from Shadow and Bone. These are two best friends who kind of grew up in orphanage together, and they, too, had their parents killed in, wars and stuff of Ravka. But the trauma of that is not super explored, because that's just not what Shadow and Bone is trying to do. But Fireborn is all about exploring that trauma, and all about exploring the trauma of this change in rulership and what happened before. It's all about all of that. It's all about the brutality of government and how very many governments, no matter what kind they are brutal and allow this or perpetrate this kind of hideous violence against their people. So it's very much dealing with very complex issues with that, and it has a very complex relationship. You see the trauma these kids have. You see this complicated best friend relationship just completely kind of turned on its head. Things are never simple with Annie and Lee. They have so many complex feelings about each other that it was just a delight to read. And I was so interested in every single aspect of this book, and I thought it was beautifully done. Well, that is my wrap up for November, all the books I've read in November. These are just some of them, and I hope that you had a good reading month in November. Let me know what your favorite books you read in November were or book, and I will see you next time. Bye!